USP Hazelton does not announce itself with noise. It announces itself with absence. No street sounds. No traffic. No city hum. Just concrete, wire, and the quiet pressure of a place built to erase individuality. By the time morning light reaches the housing units at United States Penitentiary Hazelton, it has already passed through layers of steel fencing, razor wire coils, and armed gun towers. The light doesn't arrive clean. It arrives filtered. Pale. Weak. Like it knows it isn't welcome here. Inside the general population housing unit, the day begins the same way it always does: counts, doors, footsteps, routine. Rows of cells stacked vertically. Narrow walkways. Cameras mounted high, watching everything and remembering nothing. This unit holds men who already know how prison works. They know which guards talk. Which guards don't. Which corners stay dark longer than they should. And they know that reputations enter a prison long before bodies do. On the morning of October 30, 2018, a reputation arrived at USP Hazelton that weighed more than any chain ever could. James Whitey Bulger. 89 years old. Wheelchair dependent. Legally blind in one eye. And still, to the men inside this unit, one of the most infamous criminals to ever walk into a federal prison. Bulger wasn't just another inmate transfer. He was a ghost from America's criminal past. A name whispered for decades. A man whose story blurred the line between organized crime and law enforcement corruption. In this housing unit, that history mattered. Because prisons don't forget who you were on the outside. They weaponize it. As word spread through the unit that Bulger had arrived, conversations changed tone. Men leaned against railings longer than usual. Eyes tracked movement. Faces hardened. Nobody needed an introduction. Whitey Bulger was the former boss of Boston's Winter Hill Gang. A man accused of ordering and participating in multiple murders. A man who had cooperated with the FBI while running a criminal empire, and then vanished, becoming one of America's most wanted fugitives for 16 years. Inside prison culture, that combination is lethal. Crime bosses die for reputation. Informants die for principle. And men believed Bulger was both. USP Hazelton was not known for mercy. It was known for violence. The housing unit itself was a long, rectangular concrete corridor, divided into tiers. Cells lined both sides. Metal doors with narrow windows. A control station at one end. Guard stations that relied as much on routine as on vigilance. This was not a medical unit. Not protective custody. Not isolation. This was general population. And the men inside noticed immediately that something was wrong. Why was an elderly, high-profile inmate placed here? Why was a man with known enemies not separated? Why now? Transfers happen every day, but some transfers carry a charge in the air, like static before a storm. Bulger's arrival did exactly that. Inmates began doing what inmates always do when something doesn't make sense. They assessed. They remembered. They recalculated power. In the hours before the crime, the unit remained deceptively calm. Guards moved through their routines. Cell doors opened and closed. Meals were delivered. Conversations stayed low. But tension doesn't need sound to exist. It lives in posture. In eye contact. In the way men choose where to stand. Bulger was placed in a cell on the unit's tier. Reports later said he was alone. Others claimed he wasn't. Inside the unit, facts blurred quickly. What didn't blur was perception. To some inmates, Bulger represented betrayal. To others, opportunity. To a few, obligation. Prison hierarchies aren't written down, but everyone knows them. Respect is currency. Violence is enforcement. And history is never forgiven, only collected. As Bulger settled into the cell, guards completed their checks. Paperwork was signed. The unit resumed its rhythm. No alarms. No warnings. No visible intervention. And yet, inside the housing unit, the atmosphere shifted. Inmates later said it felt wrong. Too easy. Too exposed. This wasn't a yard confrontation. This wasn't a chaotic riot. This was a controlled environment, a place where violence doesn't erupt accidentally. It is allowed to happen through silence, blind spots, and timing. Minutes stretched. Footsteps echoed. And somewhere in the unit, men who had lived their entire lives by prison logic reached the same conclusion. This was not a mistake. This was a moment. By the time guards returned for the next check, the tension that had quietly built through the unit had already transformed into something irreversible. The housing unit had done what prisons have always done. It absorbed a man's past. Judged it. And passed sentence, without ever needing a courtroom. Whitey Bulger had survived decades on the run. But inside USP Hazelton's housing unit, survival depended on something else entirely. And whatever protection he thought existed here, never did. In prison, information moves faster than guards. It travels cell to cell, tier to tier, through looks, whispers, and history. And by the time James, Whitey Bulger was fully processed into USP Hazelton's general population housing unit, every man who mattered already knew exactly who he was. Not just his name. His reputation. Prison doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about health. And it definitely doesn't care about fame. What it cares about is status, loyalty, and betrayal. And Bulger represented all three, in the worst possible way. To understand why the tension in the housing unit escalated so quickly, you have to understand how inmates see the world. This isn't chaos. It's hierarchy. It's structure built through violence and memory. In the federal prison system, certain labels carry permanent consequences. Gang leader. Contract killer. Child offender. Informant. Some labels can be managed. Others are a death sentence. Whitey Bulger's past placed him in a category that no amount of time could erase. For decades, Bulger had operated as a powerful crime boss in Boston, but what separated him from other mob figures wasn't just the violence. It was the allegation that he had secretly cooperated with the FBI while allowing murders to continue. Inside prison culture, cooperation with law enforcement is the ultimate betrayal. It doesn't matter who you were. It doesn't matter how powerful you once seemed. If inmates believe you talked, you are marked. And in the housing unit at USP Hazelton, belief is enough. Several inmates housed on the same unit had their own reputations. Men with long federal sentences. Men tied to organized crime groups. Men who had survived decades by enforcing prison rules harsher than any written regulation. They understood symbolism. Bulger's placement in general population was read as either incompetence, or permission. Because prisons don't accidentally expose high-profile inmates like this. At least, that's how inmates see it. In the hours leading up to the crime, informal power assessments began. Who was watching Bulger? Who was speaking to him? Who was avoiding him? He wasn't welcomed. He wasn't protected. He was observed. In prison, silence can be louder than shouting. Bulger's age worked against him. He couldn't physically assert himself. He couldn't project dominance. And he couldn't rely on alliances, because alliances depend on trust, and trust was the one thing he didn't have. Some inmates reportedly viewed him as a symbol of corruption, not just criminal, but institutional. A man who allegedly worked with law enforcement while others died. Others saw opportunity. In prison culture, killing a notorious figure can elevate status. It sends a message. It cements reputation. But these acts don't happen impulsively. They require alignment. No one moves without reading the room. And the room, the housing unit, was quietly aligning. Guards move through the tier periodically, but supervision inside a housing unit is never constant. Cameras watch, but cameras don't intervene. Officers rely on routine, not intuition. Inmates rely on instinct. The men who mattered understood something important. Bulger had no visible protection detail. No separation. No escort. That absence spoke volumes. It told them the institution was either unaware, or indifferent. And indifference creates space. As the morning progressed, interactions on the unit were minimal but telling. Inmates stood longer near railings. Conversations cut off when guards approached. Eyes tracked Bulger's movement. Nobody rushed. Nobody needed to. Time inside prison works differently. You don't act until certainty replaces speculation. That certainty arrived quickly. The men believed Bulger was vulnerable. More importantly, they believed no one would stop what was about to happen. Prison violence often follows an unspoken sequence. Recognition. Justification. Execution. By late morning, recognition had fully set in. Justification followed naturally. To many inmates, this wasn't about revenge or emotion. It was about order. Prison order. A twisted sense of justice enforced by those who believe the system failed. And when order feels threatened, inmates don't wait for permission. They interpret silence as consent. The housing unit itself facilitated this dynamic. Narrow walkways. Blind corners. Cells that shield activity from direct view. Guards stationed at a distance. This wasn't a chaotic yard where violence explodes unpredictably. This was a controlled interior space where every move could be calculated. Bulger's physical condition only amplified the imbalance. He walked slowly. He required assistance. He did not blend in. In prison, standing out is dangerous. Standing out with a notorious history is fatal. Other inmates, even those not directly involved, felt the shift. Some retreated into cells. Others positioned themselves strategically, not to participate, but to witness. Because witnessing matters. Stories survive longer than bodies. As the unit settled into this new awareness, one truth became unavoidable. James Whitey Bulger was alone. Not officially. But functionally. And inside USP Hazelton's housing unit, being functionally alone is worse than being officially isolated. Because it means the rules protecting you exist only on paper. The men who would soon be involved didn't need to announce themselves. They didn't need to threaten. Prison violence doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with certainty. By the time guards made their next scheduled movements, the housing unit had already reached a conclusion. This man would not leave this unit alive. And when the moment came, it would not be loud. It would not be chaotic. It would be deliberate. Because inside this unit, reputation was heavier than age, and silence was stronger than law. Violence in prison rarely looks the way people imagine it. There is no warning bell. No dramatic build-up. No crowd. Most of the time, it happens in silence, in spaces designed to swallow sound. At USP Hazelton, the general population housing unit followed its usual late-morning rhythm. Movement was limited. Inmates were either inside cells or lingering near tier railings. Guards conducted routine checks, relying on the predictability of procedure. Nothing on paper suggested danger. But paper has never stopped violence. By the time James Whitey Bulger was inside the housing unit for several hours, the prison had already made its most consequential decision of the day. It had left him exposed. The exact minute when the attack began would later be debated. Reports varied. Accounts conflicted. That ambiguity is common in prison killings, not because no one knows what happened, but because no one is incentivized to speak clearly. What is known is this: the attack occurred inside the housing unit, near Bulger's cell, during a period when direct supervision was minimal. This was not a spontaneous eruption. It was a calculated moment. The men involved did not rush. They waited for alignment, guards at distance, cameras fixed but unresponsive, inmates positioned to block sightlines. In prison, timing is everything. Bulger was physically vulnerable. 89 years old. Frail. Slow-moving. Any confrontation would be one-sided from the start. Witnesses later suggested that the attackers approached him inside or just outside his cell. There was no prolonged argument. No shouted confrontation. That would have drawn attention. Instead, the violence was immediate. Brutal. And contained. The weapons were improvised, common inside prison walls. A lock inside a sock. Blunt force instruments. Tools that leave no loud report, no echoing crack like a firearm. The first blows knocked Bulger off balance. The second wave ended any chance of resistance. Inside the housing unit, sound behaves differently. Concrete absorbs it. Distance distorts it. A man can be beaten to death just a few cells away while others hear nothing but movement. The attackers worked quickly. They had no reason to linger. This wasn't rage. It was enforcement. Bulger's age meant he could not fight back. His notoriety meant the attackers believed the outcome was justified. In prison logic, this was not murder, it was correction. The violence continued until movement stopped. By the time guards became aware that something was wrong, the moment had already passed. Prisons are reactive by design. Officers respond after alarms. After calls. After visible disruption. But here, there was no disruption. Just a body. When officers reached Bulger's cell area, they found him unresponsive. Severe head trauma. Extensive injuries. No signs of prolonged struggle. The speed of the attack was part of its effectiveness. It limited witnesses. It limited intervention. It limited accountability. Medical staff were called, but there was nothing to do. Bulger was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Inside the housing unit, inmates retreated back into routine with chilling efficiency. Doors closed. Men returned to bunks. Conversations stopped. Prison culture dictates that after violence, you disappear into normalcy. Survival depends on it. No one celebrated openly. No one reacted visibly. The unit absorbed the event the way it absorbs everything, without ceremony. Guards initiated lockdown procedures. Movement stopped. The housing unit froze in place, every inmate confined to a cell. But lockdowns don't undo what's already happened. They just preserve the aftermath. As officers began securing the area, the scale of the institutional failure started to surface. How had such a high-profile inmate been placed here? Why was there no protective custody? Why had known risks been ignored? Those questions would dominate headlines later. Inside the unit, no one asked them. Because the answers were already understood. Prisons don't operate on mystery. They operate on inevitability. In the minutes following the murder, the housing unit became a sealed environment, not just physically, but psychologically. Everyone inside knew history had just occurred. Not because a man had died. But because of who that man was. James Whitey Bulger had evaded law enforcement for years. He had lived under false identities. He had survived the outside world through secrecy and manipulation. But inside this housing unit, secrecy offered no protection. The prison stripped him of narrative, power, and time. 6 minutes. That's all it took. 6 minutes in a place designed to control everything, except the people inside it. And as investigators would later piece together timelines and assign blame, the housing unit remained unchanged. Same walls. Same cells. Same routines. Because prisons do not memorialize the dead. They erase them. By the end of that day, Bulger's body was gone. The cell cleaned. The tier reopened. And the unit moved forward, carrying one more unspoken lesson etched into its concrete. Reputation enters first. And sometimes, it never leaves. Lockdown came fast. Metal doors slammed shut in sequence, echoing through the housing unit like a mechanical heartbeat. One by one, cells sealed. Movement stopped. The unit that had been quietly alive only minutes earlier became frozen, suspended in the uncomfortable stillness that follows irreversible violence. Inside their cells, inmates waited. Some sat on bunks, staring at walls. Some stood near doors, listening. Some lay down and closed their eyes. Nobody asked questions. In prison, asking questions after a killing is dangerous. Correctional officers flooded the unit in controlled numbers. Radios crackled. Orders were given in low, clipped voices. The area around the cell was secured, though there was nothing left to secure. James Whitey Bulger was already dead. Medical responders confirmed what was obvious. Severe blunt force trauma. Extensive injuries inconsistent with a fall or accident. This was not ambiguous. It was deliberate. As investigators documented the scene, the housing unit remained locked down. Meals were delayed. Showers cancelled. Time slowed into something heavy and distorted. Lockdown isn't just a security measure. It's psychological pressure. It forces inmates to sit with what they know, and what they don't say. Fear moves differently after a killing. It doesn't explode. It spreads quietly. Inmates replay moments in their heads. Who was near the cell? Who wasn't? Who made eye contact earlier that morning? Everyone evaluates their own exposure. Guards conducted cell-by-cell checks. Searches were methodical. Property was examined. Mattresses lifted. Personal items inspected. Weapons are rarely recovered quickly. They disappear into plumbing, trash, or silence. And silence is the most reliable hiding place of all. The institution now faced a problem bigger than the body. This wasn't an unknown inmate. This wasn't gang-on-gang violence buried in paperwork. This was Whitey Bulger, one of the most notorious criminals in American history, murdered less than a day after arriving at USP Hazelton. That reality shifted the response. Federal investigators were notified. Internal reviews began almost immediately. Questions surfaced that no amount of lockdown could contain. Why had Bulger been placed in general population? Why wasn't protective custody used? Why were known risks ignored? Inside the housing unit, inmates already had their own answers. They believed the system had failed, or had chosen not to intervene. And in prison culture, that distinction doesn't matter. As hours passed, the unit remained sealed. Guards rotated shifts. Inmates ate cold meals in cells. Conversations, when they happened at all, were muted and indirect. No names were spoken. Prison culture protects itself. Those responsible did not boast. They didn't need to. Reputation travels without confession. Word spreads through absence, not announcement. Eventually, the lockdown eased slightly. Limited movement resumed under heavy supervision. The cell where Bulger had been housed was cleaned, stripped, reset. No memorial. No marker. No acknowledgement. Prisons erase quickly. But the impact lingered. Inmates understood that if a man like Bulger could be killed so easily, then protection was conditional at best. Guards understood that procedures would now be scrutinized. Administrators understood that this death would not disappear quietly. The housing unit itself returned to routine, but not to innocence. It had crossed a line. The murder exposed a fracture between policy and reality, between paperwork and practice. And it reminded everyone inside those walls of an uncomfortable truth. Prisons do not exist to keep people safe. They exist to contain risk. And sometimes, containment fails spectacularly. In the weeks and months that followed, investigations continued. Lawsuits emerged. Congressional questions were raised. The Bureau of Prisons faced public scrutiny. But inside the housing unit, none of that mattered. What mattered was the lesson absorbed by every inmate who witnessed the aftermath. Age does not protect you. Fame does not protect you. History does not protect you. Only isolation does. And even that is temporary. USP Hazelton moved on. But the housing unit never forgot the day a man with one of the most recognizable criminal names in America was killed in silence, in a place designed to prevent exactly that.